Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'd like to welcome to episode 32 of This Week in FCPA for the week ending December 9, 2016, the Fly the Not So Friendly Skies edition. In this episode, Jay Rosen and I talk about the United Airlines SEC enforcement action for domestic corruption. We take a look at a suspension effort by the Monetary Authority of Singapore for a former Goldman Sachs trader around the 1MDB scandal. We take a look at the FATF report that the U.S. is weak on beneficial ownership issues. We review Matt Kelly's blog post on the spending by Wal-Mart on their FCPA internal investigation and remediation during their enforcement action. We note the release of our eBook, Trump on Compliance, which comes from our colleagues on the Everything Compliance podcast and through the auspices of Corporate Compliance Insights. We take a look at the resignation announcement of SEC Director of Enforcement Andrew Ceresny. Then Jay talks about a couple of predictions that he has heard from GibsonDunn briefing and a event he attended developed by PwC and Sandpiper Partners. Jay also gives us a tasty preview of his upcoming weekend report. The episode comes in at just over 37 minutes. This is Tom Fox. I'd like to thank you very much for listening to This Week in FCPA. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and welcome to This Week in FCPA for the week ending December 9th, 2016. As always, I'm joined by Mr. Translations himself, Jay Rosen. Jay, welcome.
Thanks, Tom. How are things going out in Houston this week?
You know, we had actually got down into the 30s, so winter has arrived in Texas.
Well, we're still, it's all sunny in California, 70 during the day, maybe 50 at night. So it's still not a bad gig to have.
So last night we had one of the best Thursday night football games, which I suspect warmed your heart in addition to your soul with the Raiders losing and the Chiefs now leading the Western Division of the AFC. Looks like your Patriots will hold home field advantage.
If things were to end this week, but there's still, there's always a rude surprise that we get when the Patriots go to Miami and wrap the season up there. So it's things could still change, but big swing from the Raiders going from number 1 seed to the number 5 seed, and it might actually make their life a little bit easier. I don't know.
So it's not true that you want to go to Miami. You want to stay in Boston.
Boston, yeah. I didn't want to go to Miami Beach. No.
All right. So we'll have to leave the discussion of the Red Sox for another week because I think they had a big home run at the winter meetings. So, but we're on football now, so we'll just stick with that.
Okay. So let's go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, let's do it. So we had, I thought, really an interesting week in many areas that touch and are corruption compliance, but are compliance related. So maybe if I could start with what was a very interesting report from the Financial Action Task Force, or FATF, and it really talked about the gaps and weaknesses in the United States around beneficial ownership. We've had a lot of information come out about beneficial ownership this year, certainly because of the Panama Papers, and it shed a spotlight in, I think, a big gap in the U.S. fight against corruption and terrorism in the beneficial ownership stage. If you receive a bribe or you receive the benefits of corruption, you've got to put that money somewhere. And that's where offshore companies come into play, and that's where beneficial owners come into play. And unfortunately, the U.S., because of the federal system where corporations are still incorporated on the state level, and that means there's 50 states with different rules and regulations regarding corporate formation, there are weaknesses regarding beneficial ownership that undermine the effectiveness of preventive and supervisory measures by the United States government. In fact, FATF report said that it negatively impacted financial institutions and other businesses in their effort to tackle money laundering. And indeed, the U.S. scored the lowest among all G20 countries for beneficial ownership information. So, very interesting report. It highlights, I think, a serious hole or gap in that part of the U.S. fight against money laundering and indeed corruption. And if you think back to the 1MDB scandal, and there were allegations of large purchases of real estate in both California, New York, I should say both, should not say both because it was California, New York, and Miami once again, by companies with beneficial owners who, so the true ownership was disguised. So hopefully that's something that can be worked on in the coming years, but a big gap in the U.S. fight against bribery and corruption and terrorism because of the lack of information on beneficial owners.
And since you bring up beneficial ownership, we need to give a shout out to our friend Bo Richardson at Bureau Van Dyke.
Okay.
And they are one of the top firms in the field to provide both domestic and international beneficial ownership information. And should you have interest in learning more about that, Bo and his colleagues would be happy to tell you how they can help.
Next, Jay, we had once again, would appear to be tangential issue pop up around bribery and corruption, but it really shows kind of how it all relates together. And that is a regulatory entity called the Monetary Authority of Singapore has filed an application to suspend a former Goldman Sachs trader in conjunction with the 1MDB scandal. This former Goldman Sachs trader now, he led and was the client relationship manager for Goldman Sachs with the 1MDB, which is a Malaysian sovereign wealth fund, and led Goldman Sachs' effort on 3 bond offerings, which I think raised about $1.2 billion for the fund and hundreds of millions of dollars in profits to Goldman Sachs. The reason that they are seeking to suspend him is not for those activities. It's for yet another activity. He provided a letter of reference to financial authority and financial institution in Luxembourg for one of the key players, Mr. J. Lowe, who's alleged to have been part of the group that purloined monies and funds from the FCPA. And in this letter on Goldman Sachs letterhead, he indicated that Goldman Sachs had performed substantive due diligence on Mr. Lowe and that there were no red flags present on him. And Goldman Sachs was not aware of this, apparently, has disavowed and did disavow the letter, said it was not correct. So the Monetary Authority of Singapore is seeking to suspend the Goldman Sachs trader, but it shows a couple of things, or it raised a couple of things for me, Jay. The first is when you perform due diligence, you have to do the due diligence. You cannot rely on the representations of a third party. You cannot rely on representations of self-certification. We saw that in Unaoil, companies that allow self-certification for due diligence and compliance programs. If you rely on that, it's not going to give you any protection going forward. So I thought that was an interesting kind of tie-in to our greater anti-corruption compliance practice, yet it was something that would not seem to have been really been a part of it.
And in your blog that you read about this earlier in the week, I think you also hypothesized that this could be a much more global matter here, that we're not just looking at Singapore, but this the tentacles of this case might reach a lot further as we keep digging.
Absolutely. But you had some hot topics that come out of the sunny weather of Southern California and perhaps even a little bit further up the coast. So why don't you give us those?
Sure. So as Tom said, we actually had an SEC and DOJ event here in Los Angeles yesterday, and it was a very interesting program. We had a couple representatives of the DOJ, Stephen Cazares, who's an assistant AUSA Deputy Chief of Major Fraud, and Richard E. Robinson, who's an assistant AUSA Senior Litigation Counsel, and then representing the SEC was Michelle Lane. And this is a program that they've done. This was the 10th year in a row, and they have representatives from the government, and then they had a couple of outside counsel who are former DOJ and SEC who now work in the private sector. And it was a really informative 4-hour session. First of all, they started off by what we've been doing in the FCPA arena, kind of hypothesizing what their jobs and their future may look like under a Trump presidency. Most of the people use the SEC and DOJ disclaimer to voice their personal views. And, it was a really very candid conversation, especially from folks speaking from the government. One of the interesting things that we heard is that there should be 2 enforcement decisions coming out within the next month or so, based here in Southern California. One of them is FCPA, and another one will be another issue dealing in the fraud department. So, the wheels in my head start spinning, and I'm wondering what kind of matter could be coming out of Southern California. Maybe it has something to do with the motion picture studios, which have been under investigation for several years. So that's one thing that's interesting and worth watching. Another event that was happening at the same time, just a couple streets away, is that GibsonDunn was giving a presentation about the road ahead, DOJ and Federal Enforcement, also what would happen under the Trump administration. And what I found interesting from an FCPA perspective is that the moderator, who is a partner in the GibsonDunn LA office, and she heads up their crisis management group. Her name is Deb Yang, and on this past Monday, she met with President-elect Trump at the Trump Towers, and she's under consideration to become the next head of the SEC. So it's very rare that anything of his FCPA nature comes up in LA, and for 2 things to be happening on the same day, I figured that we were quite lucky to be the beneficiaries of that.
So with I've been thinking about your query about what companies it might be that would have a major enforcement action announced, or at least there'd be a major announcement. And if it's going to be limited to Southern California, I agree. Some of the movie industries may I know they are previously announced that they have ongoing investigations, but perhaps a large construction company or some other entity or another that just really not on our radar. But with Deb Yang, really any thoughts one way or the other on the type of prosecutor or type of head of the SEC she might be? I know she is a former prosecutor, so those people tend to be a little bit more law and order than other folks. So it might mean kind of a continuation of what we have seen with Mary Jo White. But really, any thoughts you might have on that?
Yeah, I would say she's extremely qualified. She was an attorney here in the Central District of California, and on many very high-profile bet the firm type matters, she leads those at Gibson. So she is just, as you said, she's very much law and order, and I think it would be a great appointment to the Trump administration, and it would be nice to find somebody that is not a billionaire or doesn't have any other agendas, which many of the picks thus far have seemed to display. So I think it would be a great appointment, and we'd be very excited to see that from a Southern California perspective.
We did have some news from our friends at Wal-Mart. I think last week, Wal-Mart filed a quarterly report detailing the continuing costs they've had on their FCPA investigation and remediation. And Matt Kelly, our colleague from the Everything Compliance podcast, wrote about it on his blog, Radical Compliance, in a post entitled Wal-Mart FCPA Cost $820 million and counting. And in it, he listed the amount of monies that Wal-Mart has spent by fiscal year, and then by quarter for each year. It's really an excellent resource to tell you the amount of money spent, and you see how Wal-Mart ramped up in 2013, 100 million, in 150 million, 157 million, in 2014, 181 million, in 2015, 173 million, 2016, 126 million. But he breaks it out by investigative cost and remediation cost for the compliance program. And the investigative costs, as you would suspect, Jay, are considerably higher at 557 million. But the compliance program remediation costs are 263 million. And the thing that really struck me is a couple of things. First of all, the significant decrease, certainly in the past 2 fiscal years, of cost, both for the investigation and the ongoing compliance program remediation. That would probably speak to that the investigation has or had tailed off a little bit. And then from the remediation standpoint, that the compliance program had matured and less direct immediate costs were required and more ongoing costs. And as you have talked about, sometimes you, as Mr. Translations, are able to help companies reduce their ongoing costs in effective ways with your services. I suspect others vendors can provide similar cost-effective mechanisms on an ongoing basis. So reduction in cost over the past couple of years. And Matt also put in a great chart, a bar chart, which charts the spending, but it shows in the graph those lines. And then he takes a look at kind of behind the numbers and what it might show that I've just articulated. Wal-Mart hired Jay Jorgensen, who I think was just a brilliant hire to be their DC lawyer. I think he was at GibsonDunn, but perhaps another firm. Anyway, he went to be their global chief compliance officer, and he's really worked very well to strengthen a program that really was not existent before. So kudos to Jay, kudos to his team, because one of the things that they have done is they've gone out on the speaker circuit and talked about it. And not only has this benefited Wal-Mart, but Jay, I think it's benefited the greater compliance community because they've talked about the challenges of putting in a compliance program when you have 2.2 million employees across the globe, and when you have nearly $500 billion in annual revenue, and you have a workforce education literally from almost zero schooling up through obviously PhDs and JDs. So kudos to Jay, kudos to Wal-Mart for putting this program in place. And then Matt also points out that at least it was reported in the press this fall that the DOJ and SEC proposed a $600 million settlement for Wal-Mart's FCPA matter, which was rebuffed by the company. It's unclear whether or not the matter will be resolved before the administration changes. Matt speculates that perhaps Wal-Mart's waiting for a change in administration. They think they will get off with less punishment. The, of course, downside to that is if you leave that open, you're still open. And corporations want nothing more than certainty, so they may want to close this out by year-end for the year-end 2016 books. So this is one that everybody's watching. I know you've been involved, so you can't really comment on a lot of the formal stuff, but kind of from the outsider perspective, looking at what Matt has written, anything that jumped out at you?
Well, first of all, I wanted to give a correction. So Jay was actually at Sidley Austin before he joined
Thank you.
Wal-Mart, so just wanted to get that out there. Actually, Matt's got me thinking about what my weekend read is going to be, and it's the question of during the first Super Bowl when the Patriots were playing the Rams and there was about 30 seconds left. You remember that Coach Madden said, take a knee, run out the clock, and go to overtime?
Right.
So the question here is I want to take a look at some of the ending years at an administration change. So take a look at the juncture when Clinton left and Bush came in, and then when Bush left and Obama came in, and take a look if there were any of these matters that were hanging out at the end, and whether you go for what you know and deal with the regulators who've been working the matter for the last some odd years, or do you throw the dice and see what's going to happen in OT. So I think it's, I would agree with you, Tom, that I think the sooner that this matter can get settled, the better off it is. And I would just want to be curious, where do you think that $600 million number came from? How do you think it was leaked, and what is the strategy of putting that out in the press right now?
It's really no way to tell, because you don't know how much of that was Department of Justice criminal penalty. You don't know how much of that was a SEC civil fine and profit disgorgement. You don't really have any insight into how that number was derived. We don't have any insight as yet into the scope, if any, of the bribery scheme. Certainly we have the New York Times article from 2012, but we also have a Wall Street Journal article from 2015 that suggested that there was very little bribery and corruption in Mexico, although there were hints of it in other jurisdictions. So without really knowing the scope of the bribery, how high up it went in the organization, there's no way to really estimate what the basis of the penalties would be, either from the criminal side under the Department of Justice or the civil side under the SEC.
Is it safe to say that the number was just leaked by Vladimir Putin?
I think it was definitively leaked to influence the 2016 presidential election, although he may have wanted to influence the 2018 midterm elections and indeed into the 2020 presidential election. He's ramping up early.
All right, just couldn't resist. I had to be snarky on that one.
So when I say we, I literally mean we, you and I, our colleagues Mike Volkov, Matt Kelly, and Jonathan Armstrong released an eBook on Trump on compliance. It was published by Maurice Gilbert at Corporate Compliance Insights. It was based upon some of the discussions we've had on our Everything Compliance podcast, and I just wanted to give our listeners a shout out. It's available for free on Corporate Compliance Insights site. We will link to that in the show notes. If you haven't read it, I hope that you have. But the other thing I wanted to emphasize, Jay, is that this is not a one-off ebook. Maurice Gilbert has asked us to continue the conversation. We are going to be, Everything Compliance will be the site to talk about Trump and compliance, probably throughout the administration. So we're going to have podcasts on it. All of us will write from our own unique perspectives, and we'll put it together in an ebook, and then Maurice will distribute it through his fabulous site at Corporate Compliance Insights. So I hope our listeners will be interested in that, and we will all move forward with that.
Yeah, so thank you, Maurice, and your crew there. It's a great ebook. It's an interesting read, and as Tom said, I think the part that's really engaging for all of us is that we're going to be able to keep tabs on this and make this almost a living document and basically a testament to what's happening in the administration as it moves forward.
And I really have to give a shout out to Maurice, because he came up with the title for this first ebook. He's titled it Part 1, but the subtitle is It's Not the Apocalypse, Yet. So I hope you will, if you haven't downloaded that book, ebook, you will do so. And Jay, I wanted to end up with a little bit of discussion with something which I thought was very interesting, which was the Securities and Exchange Commission concluded a enforcement action against United Airlines for domestic bribery. It involved bribery at the highest levels of United, indeed the CEO and senior executives, for the chairman of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, which controls the Newark Airport. The bribe paid was a specific money loop flight route was reinstituted from Newark to Columbia, South Carolina, so that the chairman, David Sampson, who has pled guilty to extortion or corruption, I should say, could fly to his weekend home. And the really interesting thing about it, Jay, was it was the first time the Securities and Exchange Commission had used internal controls to fight domestic corruption, not based upon the FCPA, but based upon the 1934 Securities Act of 1934. And the even more interesting was that the internal control which was violated was the United Code of Conduct. And I don't think any of us had think of a code of conduct as an internal control. But if you really think through it, it certainly is. But there was as with all codes of conduct, there's language in there that says the company won't pay bribes. And here we have the CEO doing it. And so the SEC sanctioned United for allowing the CEO to violate the code of conduct. And they also sanctioned United for not having an internal control around the how routes were instituted, or in this case, reinstituted. So there was both a failure of internal controls and a lack of internal controls. If you read the SEC order, it was almost exactly what read like a FCPA case, but it didn't cite to the FCPA. And indeed, it turned out that the United had settled with the Department of Justice on the criminal side of things with a non-prosecution agreement back in July. And if you read that order, that looks just like an FCPA case. And indeed, the NPA specified that United would institute a best practices and anti-corruption compliance program that is straight out of Schedule C out of every DPA. So it was pretty clear both the Department of Justice and Securities and Exchange Commission were using internal controls in a way that had not been done before. And we now have what I've called a U.S. Corrupt Practices Act, essentially, without additional legislation. So I think this could be a really interesting development, Jay. And in the trial lawyer world, we have a saying that bad facts lead to bad law. And when you have a CEO involved in a decision which leads to a bribe being paid, that's very bad facts. And whether or not this will lead to something new, I don't know. But it's certainly now we have a precedent set both on the criminal and civil side that if a company employee from the boardroom to the shop floor violates the code of conduct, that could be an internal controls violation, and that could be an SEC Securities Act violation.
Very interesting. And has there ever been anything that's come close to this, or this is the first time?
Well, it was the first case I had found where domestically, leaving apart internationally under the FCPA, but the key here was, one, it was domestic, and two, the internal control violation was the code of conduct. And that's something every company has. Mike Volkov and I used to debate the following topic on what if a company instituted internal controls, someone violated that, did that now rise to the level of a civil or criminal violation? And I said, Mike, it can never be that violation of a company policy could be a civil or criminal violation. That's an internal company policy. Well, as I told him yesterday, it turned out he was right and I was wrong. And even more to the point, every company has a code of conduct, and that code of conduct says the things that codes you've worked under and I've worked under say. They say we don't countenance harassment, we don't discriminate, we don't engage in antitrust behavior, we don't engage in bribery and corruption, all of those things. Well, now if you do any of those, you may have an SEC internal controls violation on your hand, and that really is something that we haven't seen, certainly in the FCPA space.
Yeah, and when you read the orders, does it say that it came out of a certain jurisdiction that was prosecuting it? Was it SDNY, or where was it coming from?
It came out of the Northern District of New Jersey.
Okay.
Because that's where the conduct occurred. Interestingly, this was discovered in the investigation of Bridgegate scandal involving officials of Governor Christie's staff who were found guilty in the Fort Lee matter. This was unrelated to that. Nevertheless, it came up through that. And once again, on the bad facts make bad law, this certainly was bad facts and high-profile bad facts. So the New Jersey U.S. Attorney's Office prosecuted.
So earlier this week, you wrote more about internal controls and, how you need to look, especially with the holiday season coming about. So what kind of remediation do you think will be put into effect now at United? And I would think other airlines will want to pay attention to this as well. So how does an internal control, what would you design that would, how would it look at the routes and changes? What would be the way to write that so it's effective?
Sure. The United actually had a protocol for evaluation of routes. They did basically a business justification. Then they did a financial analysis of the route, including projections. They determined variable factors such as fuel costs that might go up or down. And then obviously passengers were factored into as well. And then a decision was made, but it was largely a quantitative decision based upon the profitability. And here we had a route that I believe went for some 18 months, and United lost $945,000 on this. The benefit they were going to receive was the Chairman Sampson scuttled their agreed upon hangar expansion in Newark, and this hangar expansion was forecast to generate some $47.5 million in profits to United. So it was a clear quid pro quo here, but United had taken the steps to determine route feasibility. It was determined to be not feasible for economic reasons. It was recommended by the committee that did that did not go forward. And then it didn't until the CEO decreed otherwise. So simply you have a protocol, you write the protocol down, you follow the protocol. If there's an exception to the recommendation of the committee charged with it, you have to justify that exception. So in this case, I would say put in an internal control where you perform your business justification, your financial analysis, you look at the risks, you get a contract in place, and then you manage those risks. If you determine not to move forward under a contract, that should be the end of the story. But if it's overridden at higher levels, that overriding that, or what we would call an exception, must be noted, and it must have a business justification in writing that can be evaluated by a regulator. So that's the internal control I would suggest.
Okay, so it's almost like if you're bringing on a third party and you have to make the business reason and you have to be the champion and you're responsible for that, that's that same kind of liability. And I guess the next question that I would ask is there anything that can happen to the CEO now? Or
well, he was terminated from United, so he's left his job. And I suppose he with the NPA, it's possible he could be prosecuted, but I would say it's less than likely.
All right, but he still paid a very high penalty for what he did.
He certainly did. That's correct.
Yeah. So I guess that also satisfies things from a Yates memo perspective.
We don't know the answer to that.
Okay. Well, very interesting case. And how would you see other countries using this now? Do you think this fuels anything from a UK Bribery Act perspective, or do you think it will increase cooperation and more things looking internally into our domestic policy and our domestic, issues?
Well, that's an excellent point. But if you've got someone violating the code of conduct inside the United States and you're a UK company, it may become a UK Bribery Act violation. Certainly could lead to more domestic prosecution of corruption cases as well.
Well, thanks so much for bringing this up. I think this is a great case to close on. I guess the one last thing we have is that Enforcement Director Andrew Ceresny has said that he's going to leave the SEC by the end of the year, and that's probably not surprising considering what's happening in Washington right now. So we'll have to look at that as a developing situation and see who they end up bringing in.
So could you give us maybe a sneak preview of the Jay Rosen weekend update?
Sure. So it's going to be called Take a Knee or Go into Overtime. And we're going to take a look at administration changes and if there are any pending FCPA matters that whether they quickly settled before the old administration left, or if they carried on to the new administration. So that's my idea. I still have to figure out and see if there's actually any data to speak towards it one way or the other. But that's what we're going to do, take a knee or go into overtime.
Well, very good. Well, Jay, once again, it's been a very interesting week in the FCPA, and have a great weekend, and I look forward to continuing the conversation next week.
Great, and thank you to everyone out there for joining us to take a look at the FCPA week that was.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of This Week in FCPA. I have two requests for you. The first is, if you have listened to this podcast on iTunes, if you could rate it, it would greatly help our rankings. The second is, if you have any questions you would like answered in a mailbag episode, please email them to me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. This is Tom Fox. Thank you very much for listening to this episode of This Week in FCPA.